Welcome to the Inside the Box podcast. I am your host, Hans Zappin, and joining me in studio today is Jeff Graham, the Executive Director of Georgie Quality. Jeff, thanks for being in studio.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Hans.
Appreciate you making the trek up here to Alpharetta.
Certainly. It's a beautiful downtown. I think in all these years, it's the first time I've been to downtown Alpharetta. So people
welcome.
need to come if they haven't.
Absolutely. Why don't we just start off? Could you just tell our listeners a little bit about Georgie Quality, what it's all about, what your mission is?
Sure. So Georgie Quality, we've been around for 24 years as an organization. We are a statewide organization. Our mission is to advance fairness, safety, and opportunity for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities and our allies throughout the entire state of Georgia. One of the primary ally populations that we work with are people living with HIV and AIDS. But we actually work across the board with a lot of folks that are interested in a lot of the policy issues that we are interested in. Allies also are certainly the family members, co-workers, parents, and friends of members of the LGBTQ community. We work primarily in the policy, legislative, and political realms is mostly how we do our work.
Okay. So how much would you say you split your time between lobbying, events, support, education?
Yeah, so I actually spend most of my time on the lobbying side, both on a local level. So we work in cities, counties, and of course down at the state capitol. I would say that about 3/4 of our total staff time is spent on a lot of our educational programs. We've got 2 leadership development programs, one for young people under the age of 30 who are living with HIV. Another for transgender individuals and non-binary and gender non-conforming folks. The goals of both of those leadership development programs is so that we can work with cohorts of about 10 to 15 people each year to train them on policy so that they can then go and be very effective advocates in their own local communities. We do a lot of research. We do media education. We've got a large public education campaign called Georgia Unites Against Discrimination, which is really focused on educating people on how discrimination takes place against LGBTQ folks here in Georgia and what we can do to correct those problems.
Those are some tall orders. It sounds. How many people do you have on staff?
So we've got, right now, we've got 6 full-time folks on staff.
Okay.
We have another couple folks that work on a contract basis with us, helping with the lobbying efforts. Right now, we're doing a big push around local non-discrimination ordinances. And then, throughout the year, we will have folks that also work on a part-time contract basis to help us with voter registration efforts or sometimes with special projects.
That's a pretty. It sounds like a pretty sizable organization.
Yeah, I mean, it's
definitely
grown over the years. When I started with the organization 11 years ago, we were 2 people. So
Okay.
It's nice to be at 6, hoping later this year to be maybe at even 7 or 8.
Okay.
To increase some of our rural outreach to folks around the state of Georgia. We've got an active membership of around 41,000 people. Total membership of around 80,000. So there's a lot of folks out there and a lot of need.
Well, talk a little bit about some of that growth over the years, maybe since the time you've been there. Why have we seen some of that growth? Is there more of a need, or is there more of an awareness?
So it's the need has always been there, and certainly I think we'll probably get into talking about how Georgia ranks when it comes to LGBT equality. But basically, there's a number of different ranking mechanisms out there. On every single score, we rank very, very low in terms of legislation, policies that actually aid or help or protect LGBTQ Georgians. So the need is there, but over the last decade, there has been a real shift in the perception of the importance of doing work on the local level. So a decade ago and 20 years ago, the belief was that everything happened in Washington, D.C., that if you won on a national level, everyone would be protected. And I think that there is a growing awareness that, the culture in Washington, D.C. for some time now has just really, frankly, been broken. It's hard to get anything through Congress because the partisanship is just at an all-time high and has been that way for close to 15, 20 years, frankly. So that inhibits some change on a federal level. Other parts of it is that, You cannot affect change in Washington if the lawmakers don't understand that this is a local issue with local needs. And so that's why we've had greater investments in us as an organization, greater attention to our work. To be able to do the work on a local level, at a state level, and the importance that that has in building a national movement. And then, frankly, at the end of the day, Georgia is just the politics of our entire state across the board, as we've changed from bright red to solid purple. It is changing across the board how people look at Georgia and think about Georgia in a whole host of issues, but especially in the LGBT space.
Well, and this may be a loaded question, but in the time you've been with Georgie Quality, would you say things have gotten better or worse for the LGBTQ community here in the state?
It has its ups and downs. What I would say is that we have seen more awareness and more support on a local level, certainly on a state level, for LGBT issues. We have seen growing awareness and support, again, very much on a bipartisan level. The legislation that we work at, down at the Capitol, we've got a handful of strong Republican supporters, growing support amongst Democratic legislators. But for the first time this last year, for instance, we were able to get an LGBT inclusive hate crime bill through the House of Representatives. And the number of Republicans that supported it, combined with the number of Republicans that stayed neutral, so they did not vote against it, gave us a 22-vote margin to get that through, which frankly was much higher than I would have anticipated. And so it shows the culture shift that is happening, but it's happening not just in the politics and policy space. It happens in the religious community. It happens in the business community. LGBT issues are just people support them. And frankly, that level of support has not changed in the decade plus that I've been doing this work. When I just came into it, we did a lot of polling and showed that overall about 65% of folks wanted to see laws that protect the LGBT community. But when you broke that down to people under the age of 40, that support was at 80 or 90%. And so now we're seeing a younger generation as they come into their own. This becomes a higher priority for them. And frankly, the old adage is as people come out and are more out about their lives, about their families, people understand the needs of the community. We're not considered other like we were when I was growing up 30, 40 years ago. We are just another part of the fabric of Georgia, the fabric of the nation, and that's a good thing. Sure. But of course, on a national level, we've seen some of our rights really be rolled back over the last couple of years. And so that's why I say it's hard to say if it's better or worse. There is more awareness, but right now some of the battles that we're fighting, especially in Washington, D.C., are pretty harsh.
Okay. Well, and I'm sure I could talk to you about the politics behind some of these issues for hours, but I do want to move on to some of the substance of your organization and what they do. And first topic I want to ask you about is the HIV/AIDS. I think it's fair to say epidemic in Atlanta.
Absolutely.
I was doing some research for this show, and there was some pretty startling statistics centered around the outbreak we've seen with a focus on the Atlanta area. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about what the state is of that disease? And
Sure. So, I mean, the South has always had a large epidemic, and Metro Atlanta as an important area where people come to. We've always had a very large epidemic. From the earliest days, we've been in the top 10 in terms of cities and states for the impact of HIV. But what we have really seen, again, it started in 2010, really, with some research that came out of Emory University, that when you break that down by demographic group, we've known that we had a problem amongst people of color kind of across the board. But there's been a lot of focus on African-American women. And then over the last few years, we've really realized that gay and bisexual African American men, transgender women, especially younger trans women and younger Black gay and bisexual men, we see HIV infection rates that rival some of the worst in the world. And it's a complicated issue to tackle. In some ways, it's always been there. The first study that showed a disproportionate impact of HIV on Black gay and bisexual men in Metro Atlanta was actually published in 1987. So it's something that's been around for a long time. I think the awareness is just now catching up with the reality. Atlanta, so it's actually Fulton County, DeKalb County, Cobb, and Gwinnett counties are 4 counties that have been slated for priorities under the Trump administration. Something that they've rolled out that I think is a great proposal is a plan to end the epidemic by putting in additional resources to really bring HIV infection rates down as low as possible and increase access to care so that people can live a healthy, long life over the next decade. We've got a lot of catching up to do, but we've seen such plans work in areas like New York, San Francisco, Chicago. It can work here in Georgia if we have the local awareness and the political will to focus on ending the epidemic.
One of the scary stats that I saw was that at Grady Hospital, they're diagnosing 2 or 3 cases of HIV every single day since 2013.
Yeah.
What kind of synergy or partnership do you have with organizations like Grady through Georgie Quality?
Yeah, we actually work very, very closely with Grady, especially their infectious disease program. It is one of the top programs in the country. I would say, frankly, one of the top programs in the world in terms of its comprehensive approach. And they also understand the importance of advocacy. So some of the real specific partnership that we do, I had mentioned we have this youth HIV policy advisor program working with people under the age of 30. So some graduates of that program are now mentoring the youth support group at Grady. So helping to provide some good advice to young people that have, in many instances, lived their entire lives with HIV, helping them to just serving as good role models and mentors for them as they transition into adult care, to understand the importance of remaining active. The statistics of 1 or 2 people a day is bad enough. But frankly, what's even worse about a lot of the folks that are being diagnosed at Grady is that they are coming in not just with an HIV positive diagnosis, but at the very same time, they're being diagnosed with AIDS, which means that these are people that have been unaware of their HIV status, and their health, frankly, has gotten to the point that it is really starting to suffer, which is then what's driving them into care. And while Grady does an amazing job of trying to help repair people, their immune system, their health, when it has deteriorated to that point, it is so much harder to be able to truly help someone when they are that sick, as opposed to someone who knows their status earlier after first being infected with HIV. That's the time that we can really help people learn how to live a very high quality of life with HIV. But it takes more testing, more awareness, and getting more people into care earlier.
And I think maybe on a related note, one question I wanted to ask you was what healthcare challenges that people across the state, LGBT folks, have that are specific to Georgia, and some of the conversations that our state legislators have had, particularly as in regards to expanding Medicaid or the waiver system.
Yeah, well, I would say that there are so many health challenges. There's been on the news a lot about the maternal mortality rate. Some of the worst in the country for just women surviving childbirth. So again, Georgia has a host of problems across the board. but we won't be able to actually address them until we can make sure that people have access to health care. And that's where expanding our Medicaid program is so critically important. So, frankly, I would have preferred that we do it just a solid expansion, but we are moving forward. Governor Kemp with developing a couple of waivers. The major waiver that we are going to be focused on is to expand the program to folks that have up to 100% of the federal poverty level. One of the issues with Medicaid that people just don't understand as a regular general issue is that this is not actually a program that is currently open to people who are poor. It is really a program that is designed for children and for pregnant women. And so everyone else, regardless of their income, kind of gets shut out of the program. Again, going back to people with HIV, currently you have to have a diagnosis of AIDS. So you have to be very, very sick. You have to be considered disabled, one, to qualify for Medicaid. And then your income can be no more than 85% of the federal poverty level. So we're talking someone who makes $8,500, $8,700 a year or less. So extremely low income. If we can just get an expansion through a waiver so that all people, regardless of their health status, up to 100% of the federal poverty level, I mean, that's going to provide coverage to about 250,000 Georgians. Who desperately need it. That would be a lot of young LGBT folks who don't have a relationship with their parents, so they are not on their parents' health insurance plans. We know that members of the LGBT community, especially transgender folks, tend to be unemployed or underemployed, so it's going to help them. And then for people living with HIV, if we have this waiver and if we do it right, we can get coverage for about 16,000 people living with HIV. That's when we can begin to make a real difference in the epidemic, because these people right now, there are federally funded programs like the Ryan White program so that they can get access to their HIV care, but they can't get access if they have diabetes. They can't get access if they break a leg. And so the healthcare system is just not working for them. And we need to make the healthcare system work for them, but there needs to be a source for funding of their full care.
Well, and Georgia's in a bit of an interesting situation in that our state legislature has pretty much given a blanket permission to the governor to apply for whatever sorts of waivers under whatever sorts of parameters that he ends up deciding.
Yeah.
How accessible has his office been to Georgia Quality, and are they listening? Are they taking your feedback?
Actually, there are some folks from his office, some of the legislators that have been very supportive of that waiver program. They're not actually coming to meet exclusively with Georgia Equality. We are part of a broader coalition called the Cover Georgia Coalition, and they are actually going to come to meet with us next month.
Okay.
I don't think I could do this job as long as if I didn't remain hopeful and optimistic that change can happen. Again, I wish that it had been a different way that we were having this discussion, but I do believe that the governor's office is open at this point in time to listening about the concerns of folks. Right now, there's been a lot of publicity around how the Grady model of providing wraparound services to folks to keep them engaged in care. It's been a very small pilot with just a few hundred people, but that's the sort of program that if we had a waiver that can provide for those sorts of wraparound services, in addition to having coverage for everyone up to 100% of the federal poverty level, we can start to make a real change in the lives of people living with HIV, but frankly across the board for Georgians.
Okay. And I'm going to switch gears on you just a little bit. I posted that we were going to be having this interview yesterday and asked for listener questions, and I did receive one that I thought was important to ask, given your role with Georgia Equality, and that is, how is Georgia Equality working with trans people from Georgia that are currently serving in the armed forces? Yeah. Who have been told that they can no longer serve their country?
Sure. So, we we just don't have the capacity to work one-on-one with folks in many areas. So we're not working directly with people in the military. There are some other legal organizations, some other national advocacy organizations dedicated specifically to providing services to those folks.
Do you want to mention a couple of those for anybody that might be listening?
If folks want to reach out to our office, we can get them connected with their. But what we are doing, and we've done this for the last couple of years, frankly, is to draw local awareness to the issue and make sure that there is a local coordinated response to push back against it. So primarily focusing on getting members of Congress to oppose this. Frankly, Congress, if Congress would pass legislation protecting trans service members from a hostile administration, that could make a difference. So it's focusing a lot on communicating with Congress. A lot of that is also educating the public on the fact that transgender service members have served their country proudly and honorably and should not be denied the ability to continue to serve their country, that this actually goes against the in-depth studies that the military leadership itself have done over the years. We've had, through our Georgia Unites Against Discrimination campaign, for several years now, we've worked with a number of transgender veterans to speak out on this issue. And one of the reasons that we work specifically with veterans is that the veterans don't run the risk of being discharged that active military members do. So that's why we try to get active military members connected with some of the groups that can provide specific legal support to them, while we then work on identifying veterans to do letters to the editor, to do media interviews, to do blog posts, to tell their stories about being in the military and their stories of why others should be allowed to serve honorably.
Do you believe that this policy is a violation of 14th Amendment?
I'm not actually an attorney, so I always kind of hesitate to get that specific with constitutional law. I do believe, though, that that the policy is immoral and unethical. There is no reason, absolutely no reason, to deny transgender folks the ability to serve their country with honor. The statistics around healthcare costs, around military readiness, those have all proven to be absolutely false. This is a political argument directed at demonizing a group of people that are trying to serve. And these people deserve our respect as any other member of the military deserves. And it is, again, legal arguments aside, it is immoral and it is wrong to jeopardize their ability to serve.
Okay. I want to bring it back to a local level. Appen Media Group actually just acquired the Dunwoody Crier. And Connor here, who's off camera and producing this show for us, he actually just covered the story of the Dunwoody City Council that passed the hate crime ordinance within the city. So Georgia is one of 5 states that does not have a state crime bill on the books. Why are hate crime bills so important, and what is Georgia Equality doing to promote the recent bill that you mentioned earlier did just pass the House?
Yeah, so we work very, very closely with the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, on this. They've been a solid partner for 20 years on this issue. The reason that we need hate crime legislation, there's a couple solid reasons for that. One is to make sure that there is a uniform understanding of bias-motivated crime and how that impacts not just individuals but communities. So, for instance, at the beginning of this month, there was a young gay man in DeKalb County that was shot and murdered. And while that investigation continues to go on, The early reports were that it was a group of people that followed him from the MARTA train station, started harassing him, yelling anti-gay slurs. Belief that this group of people or a similar group of people had targeted him a week earlier. That then becomes an attack, unfortunately, not just on one young man, but an attack on all members of the LGBT community. And so we need to have a uniform understanding of that. We need to have solid statistics on this. Right now, it's totally optional for police departments to report hate crimes or not here in Georgia. And the vast majority of them just simply don't. Mm-hmm. So we have no idea of knowing how widespread this is. Violence, not just on LGBT folks, but violence against religious minorities, racial minorities, ethnic minorities. All of that is important to really know what sort of violence is happening and what is motivating that violence. And then there's, the aspect of it that, in some parts is a bit more controversial, and that is enhanced penalties for hate crimes. And that is certainly part of the state statute. What has happened in Dunwoody, what has happened in some other local communities that have passed these local ordinances is it really is around compelling local police departments to investigate and report and train. And those, I would hope, are goals that everyone could agree to. Because it's not just an LGBT issue, it's an issue across the board. The one thing with Dunwoody that I want to point out is that they also, in addition to hate crimes, passed a non-discrimination ordinance at the same time. So they are now the fifth city, believe it or not, it's only 5 in Georgia, that says that the residents of Dunwoody are protected against discrimination broadly in housing, public accommodations, and employment on the areas of race, religion, color, national origin, sex, age, veteran status, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity. Georgia is one of only 5 states, 3 states in the country that have no employment law, one of 5 states that have no public accommodations law. So Georgia is a real deficit when it comes statewide to protecting all groups of people for their civil rights. Right now, if you feel that you've been discriminated against, you literally have to be able to hire an attorney and go to make a federal court case. And for LGBT folks, that's not even necessarily an option for us because we're not explicitly covered under federal law. And it's debatable whether sex discrimination includes transgender folks. There's a precedent for that here in Georgia, but not necessarily around sexual orientation. So it's important for local municipalities to take this on their own. It also makes an important statement that discrimination in local communities is just something that goes against the local values of those communities.
And I think I should correct the record. I think I said hate crime ordinance in Dunwoody. It is a non-discrimination.
It's both.
Ordinance. It is both.
Yep, it is both. They had both of it in there. And again, it was done through consent, unanimous approval through city council. I think that also speaks to the fact that this is an issue that I do believe that local communities can and should address. And it's more about the statement of values and respecting all people and recognizing that diversity in any community makes a community stronger and more vibrant.
Do you see more of that in the near future?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. We've had 4 cities come on board since November of last year, and we're in active conversations with about a dozen more. I anticipate we're going to see at least a half dozen more by the end of this year.
So does Georgia Quality, if asked, work with some of these municipalities in helping to draft some of those ordinances?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. Could you give our listeners maybe a status update on the hate crime bill that did pass out of the state House this last session?
Yeah, so it passed with a solid bipartisan majority in the House, and it's over in the Senate Judiciary Committee. That's chaired by Senator Jesse Stone from the kind of greater Augusta area over there in East Georgia, and. He didn't schedule a hearing. We really would love to see this pass in 2020. As you said, Georgia, one of five. It's actually another state. I'm sorry, I don't remember which state it was, but recently one of the outlier states did pick it up. So now we're one of only four states. But that happened just within the last couple of months.
Okay.
There,
Wikipedia, update your
yeah,
page.
yeah, exactly. But it's an important measure around respecting diversity, and putting us on kind of the national norm. There is no reason that this does not pass in 2019, and hopefully it will pass completely in 2020.
Are there things that listeners could do to maybe encourage a hearing
Absolutely.
for that bill?
So it really is contacting the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, very specifically Senator Jesse Stone. Especially, I think that those folks who live in his district. So it's not a surprise that most legislators put more weight on what their own constituents have to say. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Sure.
And so the people who live in his district have the most influence, and I really hope that they will be speaking out.
Okay. Last question. I want to ask you a little bit about just controversial bills that seem to generate a lot of public interest over the years, whether that's a religious freedom bill or even more recently a heartbeat bill. We also see a lot of feedback, positive or negative, from the business community. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about sort of what that relationship is like and what role the business community could or maybe should play in topics or bills like that?
Yeah. Well, absolutely. The business community has a very strong voice here in Georgia. Frankly, the business community has a strong voice anywhere and everywhere. More and more, we're seeing that the business community is weighing in on what have been considered to be social justice issues in the past. We've seen it most solidly when it does come to LGBT issues, and I think the reason there is pretty solid. One, we have seen in states like Indiana or North Carolina, where they have passed legislation that is actively hostile to the LGBT community, the backlash that has happened to businesses that are located in that state, and frankly, the economic impact with people no longer wanting to do business there, go on business trips. Tourism has really suffered. Convention traffic has really suffered in those states, and Georgia depends upon all of that. I think what you're seeing with the anti-abortion bill, it goes so much further than just defining a heartbeat. It really criminalizes women, and there's a lot in there around creating definitions of personhood for fetuses that are going to be very problematic across the board if that law, if it actually comes into enforcement at the end of the year. You've seen more of the entertainment industry speak out against that. The rest of the business community has been a little bit slower to respond. But again, the people that work for these companies are the ones that are pushing the companies to take action. One of it is that there's a clear understanding that diversity is good for business. There has been, frankly, I think that the business sector has led on diversity and inclusion efforts for the last 20 years in how to create a productive workforce with the diversity that is the American workforce today, and diversity in any way that you define it. And as LGBT folks have come more into our own, we have been a part of those diversity efforts, and corporate America has responded. I think that's why you've seen specific support on LGBT issues. Frankly, they're still primarily supporting to keep bad things from happening. I think all of us wish that they were a bit more active in pushing for good legislation. So here in Georgia, if we had a civil rights law that protected people of faith with religion, as well as members of the LGBT community, suddenly we no longer have the concerns about a RFRA that opens the door to discrimination. So it could solve a problem that we have had and debated, 6 years in a row now. And it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of attention. And frankly, there are other issues I think everybody wishes that we would get to. And so I would hope that the business community will start actively pushing common sense legislation that helps everyone, while continuing to be more vocal on a number of issues that really target certain segments of our community, be it the LGBT community, be it women, be it immigrants, for stigma and attack.
So do you think Stacey Abrams' approach of stay and fight, her message to the business community is stay and fight rather than threaten to leave, is more effective? Or do you think the threat to pull dollars out of the state is more effective?
This is where it gets very complicated. I absolutely support Stacey Abrams' call to stay and fight. I live here. I am a resident of Georgia. I want there to be a good economy. I want people to have access to jobs. A lot of the folks that are impacted by boycotts are low-income workers that already are at disadvantages. They can't just easily get up and move. So I don't want to do anything that hurts our state. But at the same time, what you really see now with some of the film and television industry looking elsewhere, Arizona, for instance. There was a business report card that came out last week on LGBT issues. Arizona far outranks Georgia on some of these issues, and film and television looking to go to another state, New Mexico. Actually, I don't think it was Arizona. I think it was New Mexico. Okay. That there a lot of attention of moving productions there. So it puts us as a whole at a competitive disadvantage as a state, and business leaders need to see that reality as well. So it is staying and fighting, but it's also recognizing that the threats to our economy are very real when the government takes action that actively hurts its own citizens.
Okay. And I want to wrap up with this. We are recording what I thought was more towards the end of Pride Month, and you corrected me before we got started here and said you've got a busy couple weeks coming up. Talk to us a little bit about what some of the events are that Georgie Quality is going to be working up on towards the end of Pride Month.
Yeah, so we're certainly going to this weekend Augusta Pride is coming up. So that's a big event out in Augusta that we will be there as a statewide organization. It's important for us to be out and supporting local communities. So in addition to Augusta Pride, we've got smaller prides that are going to be happening in Norcross, going to be happening in Macon. So we'll be doing that here in Metro Atlanta. We've got actually the week of the last week in June. We're going to start off with a panel discussion that looks at the intersection of how the LGBT rights movement built off of the successes of the women's movement, that built off of the African American civil rights movement, and kind of how our communities need to support each other. Moving forward, we're going to be so that'll be Monday night. Wednesday of that week at Outfront Theater, we're going to be doing a part of a panel looking at the history of HIV advocacy, specifically in the 80s and early 90s, as we encourage people to come out to both of those events. The best way to see what may be upcoming is to look on our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, Instagram. We'll be doing that. And certainly to get access to all that we're going to be doing the month around the state of Georgia is signing up for our email action alert network at georgiaequality.org.
Okay. So if a listener wants to get more involved in the organization or give in one way, shape, or form, probably the best way to do that, go to the website?
Go to the website.
Go from there.
Definitely, yeah, and go from there.
Perfect. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for coming on the show today and talking to us more about some of the issues you're working on and your organization. We really appreciate it.
Definitely, Hans. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.